I was at a conference in Canada, not that terribly long ago, a national conference, and someone said to me, "No one preaches on holiness anymore." And I went, "I do." And without missing a beat, there was a woman there, slightly older than me, looks at me, she goes, "Yes, but someone like you shouldn't." And I said to her, there's something going on in your soul, isn't there? She goes, "Well, I didn't." I said, No, don't back up. Own it. There's something going on in your soul. Because we don't talk to each other that way. Come on. So tonight, let's break it. Let's talk about holiness. Since you seem to be the right people to do it. You know this. One of the key characteristics of our God, He is a God of holiness. At the beginning of the law, I'm assuming within the last week, almost all of you have been reading in Leviticus. And so in Leviticus 19, the declaration is so strong. It's the beginning of the law. At the beginning of the law, God says to Moses, "Moses, tell the people to be holy. For I, the Lord their God, am holy." Our God is a holy God. And He wants us to carry that, reflect that. If we're going to do that well, it's probably time to update our view of holiness. Some of you may not need to, but for some of us we do. So think about it. When's the last time you taught about, preached about holiness? When's the last time? I mean, if it's a key benchmark of our God, and at the beginning of the law He gives, He said, make sure you recognize this is who I am. This is what I stand for. This is what I have for my people. That it's time. So let's embrace it as a theology. Let's embrace it as a pattern of life. Let's embrace it as a quest, a longing, a passion for our hearts and our minds. In ancient literature, actually from antiquity, here's the line: "Show us the lives of the people, and I will show you their gods." Remember the marked contrast between the Canaanite people and the children of Israel. A marked contrast. So as you live and work throughout Europe, we don't just need to be the nicest people. Let's be the holy people. Yeah, let's be the holy people. If this was a different audience, I would give this message the title, "It's time to make holiness sexy again." The wrong audience. So we'll move ahead quickly and not spend much time there. If we're going to talk about holiness, if you ask the average person any place, all the way from the children who grew up in church to some of your children, to younger folk who've just started come to church and go, "Describe a holy person." Oh, it's a little scary. They're always older. They tend to not be the most fun people on the planet. They tend to, perception is they're religious, even rigid. That's a descriptor that comes out. Sort of stoic and serious, often have their hands folded. Not a fashion award to be won among them. And as I said, not the most fun people on the planet. That's the perception. But that's just because they don't know you. And so tonight, I'm going to ask you to take a look at Colossians chapter 3 with me, please. Let's do this. Let's run through these quickly. I don't want to do this with you. Can we? By the way, this thing's being Canadian and moving very slowly. Here we go. There we go. In your Bibles, a number of you will have a heading at Colossians 3 that says, "Rules for Holy Living." And I went, how bad a day were you having, mate, that was a heading you put here? Rules for holy living. Please don't do that. It's not rules for holy living. It's about putting on the best of Christ in your life. and living that in a unique and a fresh way. Listen to the words of Colossians 3. Since then you have been raised up with Christ. Set your hearts on things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things of this earth. Because you see, you've died. And your life is now hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will be with him in glory. This is a classic Paul passage about put off and put on. So the first one is put on Christ. Put your eyes on Christ. Set your mind on Christ. Set your heart on Christ. Go through the scriptures from the Psalms to the Pauline passages and notice where it says to put your mind, heart, eyes. What we're to focus on, what we're to see, how we are to develop and determine our reality. Set it on Christ. Keep seeking the things that are above, not the things of this earth. Seek the things above. And note here your position in Christ. Now, classically, when we have looked at passages like this, a very traditional view is very often, very, very often, it is a problem orientation to life. Why are we not being happy? A problem orientation life. I remember as an early prof, I would have students, always male students, who would write papers that if they could ever clean up their life enough, if they could ever be holy enough, then God would use them. I used to write more back to them than they wrote to me and said, wrong answer. This is not human effort. This is not you being better. This is not try harder, do better, do more. This is figuring out the best of Christ in you, the hope of glory. Now, one of the challenges we have is if you focus on your problem orientation, your mindset is focused on the problem. Almost no one gets better focusing on their problem. That's why I mentioned the first night, all of the phrases we have about should and must and ought and need to, all the phrases we have about I'm going to try harder, I'm going to do better, I'm going to work on that one. Human effort, not the way to get there. Paul will make it very clear. And so he says very, very clearly, let's put your mind, put your eyes on Christ. If it's not a traditional view of problem orientation, then let's go to the other side. Let's dream for just a moment. What would your life look like if you could see it from God's point of view? See, that's why very often when you bring up some of your stuff that annoys you, he just doesn't seem to pay attention. Because in his mind, it's not the key issue. It's just annoying. It annoys him. It annoys you, so it annoys him. But it doesn't keep his spirit from working. The key is to figure out, when I set my eyes on Christ, what will my life look like from his point of view? We covered it the first night. Part of it's being free. A lot of it's just being full. And as some of you have picked up this week, it's fun. It's being conformed to the very image of his Son, the text tells us. So very, very simply, put your eyes, put your mind, put your heart on Christ. The next part of this passage unfolds in verses 5 through 8 like this. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed, which is really idolatry. You see, because of these things, the wrath of God is coming. Remember, you used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now, marked contrast, transition, but now. Rid yourself of the things such as anger and rage and malice and slander and language that's just not healthy. These are what we call soul issues. And in the next part of the passage, can we click? Do not lie to each other, since we've taken off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge of the image of the Creator. You see here, there's no Gentile, nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all. If we're going to put our eyes on Christ, then we've got to put off the old stuff. By the way, the Bible doesn't actually translate this in English very often as stuff, but that's what it is. It's sort of all of the stuff that gets in the way. Let's get rid of it. And notice our marked contrast of phrases like, I'm going to work on that. And Paul goes, no, 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 no. Put it to death. Put it to death. Don't leave them around. It was one of our sort of insightful Baptist writers who talks in terms of do not manage your sin. Don't manage your sin. You put it to death. So many of our phrases are we attempt to manage it. And that's not how it works best. Now, in the history of the church, we've had two categories of sins. You know this. Paul outlines them. The first one is the sins of the flesh. In the church, we've called them the hot sins. The hot sins of passion, of sexuality, of human sensuality. They're the hot sins. The other ones are the cold sins of the heart. If you look over the past history of the church, we have disciplined almost exclusively the hot sins. Surefire way of church discipline is to be caught in some level of unhealthy human sexuality. Now, if you get caught with anger and gossip, well, you just struggle with that. Struggle means you actually put up a fight. I have people tell me all the time what they struggle with, and I said, don't lie to yourself. You're not struggling. You just give in to it. Struggle means you actually put up a fight. You're trying to kill the little sucker. You don't. You just play along. So come on. It's time to put them to death, and as the text tells us, be renewed from within. Allow me one more Diana story. I was a young dairy farmer when I started dating her. It's tough to have a dating life when you're a dairy farmer. For so many reasons. Timing one of them. Just sheer smell is another. It's not that funny. So on the average Saturday, I would spend 14 hours of work. I would be able to get off at 7. So from 5 a.m. till 7 p.m., I was in the barn with roughly 500 head of cattle. So everything about me was sort of cattleish. So because you're around that many, and they eat a lot, and they discharge a lot, I would wear coveralls. And so I'd have boots and coveralls, and my clothes would have funny little brown spots all over them. And I would get relieved at 7 p.m. and I had a date at 7:30. So I would go home. I would use just numerous, 3, 4, 5 kinds of shampoo, all sorts of soaps. I would get as clean as I could get in a short amount of time. And I was clean. What clothes do you suppose I put on? Well, if I wanted a second date, I never put those nasty clothes back on. Folks, that's the image of your life. You have been made clean. Don't you dare go back to those old patterns. Because it's as bad as once you have cleaned up for something fun to go put on the old nasty clothes. You're smart enough to not do that. So come on. The images that stick in your mind, you're not struggling with this. Let's put them to death so that we can be free for the best stuff that's yet to come. Let's do it. Next part of this passage, verses 12 and 13. Therefore, as God's chosen people, I love this part. As God's chosen people, this is how He sees you. Holy and dearly loved. Just stay there. God's chosen people. Holy and dearly loved. clothe yourselves, literally put on compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. Come on, hang in there with each other. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If anyone has a grievance, forgive just as the Lord forgave you. Now, I know this is difficult for some of you, but so much of the teaching of the Newer Testament is not behavior modification. There's very little classic behaviorism. You do this, God will do this. You don't do this, God won't do this. There's very little of that. Forgiveness is one of them. You don't forgive, He can't forgive you. If you are one who holds resentments, bitterness, hurt, judgments, come on, let it sink in. He's going, my hands are kind of tied. I need you to take care of your part so I can take care of mine. Because you see, if not, this sort of root of bitterness takes hold. Ingrid's got a great talk on the bitter root of judgment. When she gives it in ministers' groups, there's literally weeping. Because it becomes the pattern of your life. The pattern of your life. It's how you see truth and reality. It's how you see people. It's how you get self-protective. It's how you live your life rather than as instructed here. So let's do it. Let's put on forgiveness. Put on forgiveness where we are chosen by God, holy and dearly loved. Put on forgiveness because you have His Spirit within. It's probably time for a full life confession. In our circles, everybody who's a leader has done a life confession. I was the first one that I knew of to do it, just because I needed it more than anybody else I knew. I was moving along well in ministry. Things were progressing, except I knew there was something that was still holding me back. Couldn't quite put my finger on it. I called it compulsion. It seemed to have more of a life and have control over me more than I had over it. And so I thought, I got to deal with this. So I got my pastor and a trusted older friend, and we just talked it through. I asked for 2 hours. It took longer than that. I didn't come to faith till I was a young adult. I had more there than I thought I had there. And I remember halfway through looking at my pastor friend, looked up, and I was kind of humiliated, I guess is the best word. And I said to him, am I going to be okay? He goes, yeah, it's just no fun. Finished up. Took longer than I expected. Turned to the old man of wisdom and I said, how bad is it? And he goes, oh, it's bad. I was hoping for a little more affirmation. He goes, oh no, it's bad. And I said, is there anything to be broken? He goes, nothing to be cast out, but we got to break some stuff. And walked me through a series of breaking holds, patterns, etc. I remember it like it wasn't that long ago. I was actually in my late 30s. Whatever the compulsion was, broke that day. It broke. So in the circles we run in, everybody just does one. Oh, it's not fun. But the freedom that comes is remarkable. And so once you are one of those who's received forgiveness, offer it. By His grace, offer it. As a young pastor, I was moved. I loved my people, but I thought, they cognitively get forgiveness. I'm not sure they feel forgiven. And I was always trying to figure out, how do we walk them through this? So we trained our elders, trained lots of people. I used to have sessions, and we would just have confession sessions for people who needed them. I mentioned this morning, church in British Columbia. Great bunch of people needed forgiveness at a far deeper level. There was an older woman in our church. She seemed to have an emotional psychological disorder. She had a tough story. I only knew this much of her story, but I knew she had 5 children who wanted nothing to do with her, and I knew she lived alone. And I said to her, Ruth, on Wednesday afternoon, I'm going to carve out the entire afternoon. I want to hear your story. And she just shook and she goes, no one's ever wanted to hear my story. And I said, I do. I think she was 38 years older than me. And I said, I'm going to be there all Wednesday afternoon. If you want somebody to hear your story, I will be there. I won't book anybody else. Come if you want. She came late. She brought a giant box of tissues. And she just sat there staring at me. She goes, why do you want to hear my story? And I said, I think it would be good for your soul. And she began to tell her story. She grew up in a church in a small town. She was in her 20s and had never married. 27, very specifically. Back then, that was old to be getting married for the first time. By the way, in New York City now, the average age of people getting married is 37 and a half for the first time. Yeah, it's a different world. There was a new young assistant pastor in town, and he took a liking to her. He was younger than her. They ended up getting married, and in a 6-year period, she had 5 children, and he left her. And the senior minister and the regional superintendent said to her, because he's a minister, you probably shouldn't talk about this. And she never did. And it ate up her soul. Her children didn't want anything to do with her. It wasn't pleasant being around her. She cried all the time. Every once in a while, outbursts of something. As I listened to her, she just wept and wept. I just went over and knelt down beside her and put my arms around her. There was no great flair to this day. I hugged her. I'm good at quick hug. Hug and release. Hug and release. It's a good ministerial thing to learn. Especially for those of you that are really good looking. Learn it well. Here's what I found very interesting. Over the next few weeks, Ruth cried lots less. Within a 5-week period, I got letters from all 5 of her children. This was before the days of email. And they said, we don't know what you did with our mother. We don't want to know. But she's different. We like having her around. Her grandchildren like her now. The transformation was just remarkable. Someone heard her story. She released all the stuff in her soul. I don't want to overstate it. It's kind of that simple, folks. It's kind of that simple. Let's see how the passage wraps up. A strong statement in the transition over all these other virtues. Now, the final one, put on love. Put on love. Because you see, it binds all the others together. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. As members of one body, you are called to peace. Be thankful. Let the message of Christ, the word of Christ, dwell richly among you. Teach, admonish one another with all wisdom, psalms, hymns, spiritual songs from the Spirit in your hearts of gratitude to God. And whatever you do, word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. So our final one is let's put on love. Put on love. It's a perfect bond of unity. It's the thing that pulls us together. It's your peaceful existence in Christ. Notice, there is the peace of Christ in your hearts and the word of Christ deeply within you. Those are pretty clear passages, words, etc. In our seminar in mentoring, we talked about there's a descriptor of people's spirits. We said, notice how recognizable some of the words about people's spirits happen to be. Things like the end of the Pentateuch, Moses, a man whom the Lord knew face to face. Joshua, a man in whom was a spirit of wisdom. Caleb had a cool one. He had a different spirit. He followed the Lord wholeheartedly all of his days. There's a descriptor of their spirit. So one of the assignments for you is to say, what is that descriptor? If you're one who loves, you remember that was the phrase of the earliest church. Look at how they love one another. For the IBC, who's going to plant churches all across Europe, if the benchmark of IBC churches, those are the people that love one another, you've got something going. It's kind of your call. Decide what it is like. What is that descriptor? I had a request from a student wife just a few years ago. I had never met her. She asked if she could meet with me. I'd had her husband in one course. And she asked if she could meet with me, and I said, I have a 15-minute window. It's in the morning. After you drop the kids off, come in. You got 15 minutes. So she came in, and I said, talk fast. She was nervous. I said, no pleasantries. Just, you got 14 minutes. Keep going. And we talked. It was good. Her story was, I can't remember if she was 15 when she got pregnant or 15 when she had her first child. But by 23, she had 6 children. And then her and her husband came to faith and wanted to go into ministry. But there was lots of baggage. And she heard I was pretty good at this, wanted to come talk to me. And so 13 minutes wasn't quite enough. I listened to her a little bit, prayed for her, and I said, there's a couple women that'd be good for you. Let's talk you through this. Let's just make sure there's somebody to help you to process this. Prayed with her, walked over, ushered her towards the door, hug and release. Quick, close the door. I sat down and started to work, and there was a knock on the door. I went, oh, geez, who's here now? Went, and she was standing there. And I wanted to say to her, your time is done. And she just stared at me, and I said, yes. And she goes, I don't know what to say. And I said, you're the one that came back. She just had this far-off look. And I said, seriously, I have a course coming up. I need the time. Can I help you? And she said, just listen. She said, you must be the most secure man who's ever lived. I went, yes, I am. How do you respond to that? I said, okay, tell me why. And she said, men have hit on me my whole life. She goes, I'm told I'm very attractive. She goes, I've played it. You treated me differently than anyone's ever treated me in my life. And then she got very choked up and she goes, this must have been what it was like for Mary Magdalene to meet Jesus. I said, you're welcome. Thank you. I said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for men, but it's time to be free so you can love and be loved the way you dreamed to have it. So let's figure out how to get you there. They have an interesting story. They have kept going. They've made great strides. She has figured out how to both give and receive the love she's always wanted. Put on love. Let's wrap this up, shall we? Here's what it looks like. If you're going to embrace God's perspective on holiness, let's update your view. Not with lots of words, not with shoulds and musts and oughts and need tos, not with try harders or do betters or do more. 5 words or less. What does holiness look like in your life? If I'm going to do this, what's one way? I'm going to put my eyes, set my mind on Christ. Just one focused area. I'll give you mine. Since I now live alone, mornings are my hardest time. If I get up and do anything else in the morning, the day doesn't go well. I have 3 things I have to do in the morning. First one starts with putting my eyes on Christ. The second one is get creative juices flowing. I make myself write 3 pages every morning. Most of it's not worth keeping. Sometimes it only has 7 words per page, but I got 3 pages done. I've begun to write poetry. You've picked up pretty quickly, I do not have a poetic flair. Every once in a while, it sounds nearly prophetic and inspired. Sometimes it looks like it needed done by noon and it was done, and sometimes it seems like a kindergartner wrote it. But it brings me back to God and says, you have given much into my life. May I express it back to you in unique ways. What are two aspects of the old self that it's time to leave behind for good? We're going to end our service in just a moment. We've asked our resource people to each take one corner. And whether you want to use one of us or a trusted friend, decide, is there something to pray out of my life or something to pray into my life? Is there something to leave behind or is there something to welcome? We're going to give you an opportunity. A number of you have said, I feel like I want a good old-fashioned altar call. It's not very conducive here. So we're going to give you an opportunity to do that in just a moment. Is there some aspect of the old self to leave behind? Is there one scenario, person, a situation, an issue of my soul that it's time to embrace? Forgiveness for that one. And one very specific prayer. To embrace the love and peace of Christ in this passage. Growing up as a kid on the farm, I played beside a river, a stream, a creek, a crick. Wherever you come from, it has different names. Some of you remember those and playing along those yourself. What I find interesting about those is it's fun for a kid to play in the water. And one of the things I discovered is that rivers wind because there's things that block the flow of the water. Now what we're going to cover tomorrow night is how the Spirit of God flows from the very heart, from the throne of the Father straight to you. Your job is to make sure there's nothing blocking that. I remember a neighbor just across the road. There were, in a mile and a half, there were only 3 houses. And there was a backhoe, one of those that was first on tracks that had a big arm, and they were rerouting some stuff. I was 10 years old, and I went over to the backhoe operator and said, could I have a little bit of your time? I want to angle the river on my side and take this dog leg out so it flows straighter. He goes, are your parents okay with that? And I said, I'm sure they are. I was 10. What did I know? I wasn't going to lie to the guy, but I needed it done. He came over and did it for me. Here's what I figured out. Listen closely. I figured out one thing I could do was take a pretty wide flow of water like this in the river. And I could put a rock here and a rock here and another rock and another rock and find a smaller, big one depending on what I needed and put it here. And I could take a wide flow of water and bring it down to just a trickle. If I wanted to be imaginative, I'd go get logs and throw it over and actually dam it up. I could stop the flow of water in that river as a kid. You're smart people. That is the picture of the flow of the Spirit into your life. It comes like a river. A leftover resentment and bitterness issue here. Some unforgiveness here. A sin here. Some neglect here. Some uncontrolled things you hope nobody ever finds out about here. And you have brought the flow of the Spirit from broad in your life to just a trickle. And you wonder why life and ministry seem hard. Your job is to get rid of those. Because the dream of the Father for you is that as you welcome the Spirit, it comes in full force. Strong, vibrant, flowing. It's straight from the heart of the Father, straight to you. And when you do that, you just represent Him so well. Put your eyes on Christ. Put off the old stuff. Come on, put it off. Put on forgiveness and put on love. It's the perfect bond of unity that ties them all together. Close your eyes with me, if you will, please. Oh, Lord, you know us so well, don't you? Just in these next few moments, we're going to ask you to do something that you long to do. Draw your children near. Set them free. Replace the old stuff with new stuff. It's amazingly cool. We've talked about things this week that sometimes we don't always talk about. So if there's anyone here that it's time to leave something behind or time to embrace something, put your finger on it so clearly they can't miss it. And then whether it's coming to one of the resource people or a trusted friend sitting beside them, let's pray it out of our life or into our life.